Hello and a very warm welcome to the brand new edition of Policy Watch. I'm Kriti Mishra. To facilitate fundraising by startups, the Department for Promotion of Industry and Internal Trade has proposed tax relaxation in the income tax laws pertaining to sale of residential properties and carrying forward of losses. These suggestions are part of Startup India Vision 2024, prepared by the DPIIT for the government to promote growth of budding entrepreneurs who face difficulty in raising finances. The document aims at facilitating setting up of 50,000 new startups in the country by 2024 and creating 20 lakh direct and indirect employment opportunities. And to talk more about the topic, I'm joined by Mr. Ajay Dua, former Secretary, Ministry of Commerce and Industry, Mr. Wadhwa, Deputy General Manager, Taxman, and Mr. Rameesh Kailasam, CEO, India Tech Org. Welcome to Rajya Sabha Television, all of you. Mr. Dua, let me begin the show with you first. Prime Minister yesterday talked about creating 50,000 startups by next 5 years. In fact, the government had provided a breather to startups from angel tax. Now the tax proposal of DPIIT, how important is it for providing impetus to the startups in the country?
I think any tax relief for the startups is a welcome feature, because all kinds of difficulties in setting up business and growing it, startups face at the beginning of their entrepreneurial venture. And I would think that given the fiscal space, because all this will get determined by the kind of fiscal space which the government has, and we know that it's rather limited, the government, anything further than what was given, say, in February 2019, when the eligibility for DPI, by that time it was still DIPP, my old department, they had relaxed the angel tax application, and we also have other provisions under 3 other sections of the income tax. I would think that continuation of those, if it is possible to make those the eligibility a little wider and the tenor of the benefits little longer, all that would help. But 2 things I think have happened outside the budget also, which one should mention. One, the government had set up earlier a fund, seeding done by the government and operated by the Small Industry Development Bank of India, SIDB, for which the expectation was that about 3,000 crores would be dispersed by the year 2018-19 to venture capital funds, which in turn lend to the small entrepreneurs. We've seen progress there. About 2,200 crores was reached, about 1,000 crores less. It is that fund which first the President referred to in his address to the Parliament, and then yesterday Prime Minister Modi referred to it, saying that that fund, we are going to be enlarging it to be of a much larger size, so that many more venture capitalists can avail of it, and they in turn can lend to the startups. Second, yesterday's announcement by the chairman of SEBI, Mr. Tyagi, is also relevant in this context, because for a long time their startups, and all of them are really small as well, they had been demanding that when they seek funds from outside, and it should not happen as it happens today, that their equity gets diluted, and they bring the idea, they put in the hard work, and then when they are trying to raise funds, the equity gets transferred to the new investor. That the startups share, those shares should be separate from what is offered for raising money. The SEBI chairman declared that yes, we are in tune with that. The Startup Industry Association had been demanding it, and that we will come out with a framework for it. So I would say budget as well as announcements to support it are in line with what the expectation of the government is from the startups going forward.
So that's an important announcement by the SEBI. Moving forward, Mr. Wadhwa, Tell me, the DPIIT is talking about these tax proposals. Now, most of the budding entrepreneurs sell their residential properties to fund their projects. How important is this proposal for fundraising for startups?
So let's talk about this, why this angel tax and what are all the relevant provisions under the Income Tax Act which have been introduced in the taxation laws for the startups. So as of now, the section you have talked about is 54GB, section 54GB, which provides exemption to the individual if they invest the capital gain they earn from selling their residential properties into an eligible startup. So this is one section. So now actually there are 4 provisions which actually impact the startups. These are section 54GB, section 54EE, and the most talk about section 56(2) VIIB, which we call sometimes angel tax, and section 80IAC. So as of now, the notification issued by the DPIIT in February 2019, it talks about only 2 provisions, section 56(2) VIIB, that is angel tax, and section 80IAC. So as of now, DPIIT has not said anything about the other 2 exemption. So if DPIIT comes out with another notification to give some more benefit to the eligible startup, that would be a welcome step. In capital gains, we have 2 provisions, section 54GB, which provide exemption to the promoter, I would say, because these are the promoters who invest the capital gain from sale of their immovable property into eligible startup. And the another section we have 54EE. 54EE gives you some exemption if you invest your capital gain in the funds notified by the government. Surprisingly, as on date, government didn't notify even a single fund in which if you make some investment, you can claim the exemption under the capital gain chapter. So if DPIIT comes out with additional notification for this 54EE and 54GB, that would be a welcome step. But there are lot of issues which are still not talked about, or which are some fallacies in the taxability of the startup, which I think finance minister should address in the forthcoming budget. So I would raise a few points which could really benefit a startup. So if you look at the definition of the startup as given in the DPIIT notification, it says if your turnover is up to 100 CR, then you can become an eligible startup for section 80IC exemptions and for angel tax. But income tax says otherwise. So income tax says if your turnover is up to 25 CR, then you can claim the exemption under section 80IAC. So these 2 threshold limits under the DPIIT notification and the 80IAC, they are not in alignment with each other. So finance minister should immediately bring the threshold limit in the DPIIT notification and the 80IAC section with each other. So just take an example. If turnover of an eligible startup is 30 CR, so as per DPIIT, it's an eligible startup. He should be entitled to get the exemption for angel tax and 80IAC. But Income Tax Act does not give you any exemption under section 80IAC because it says your turnover should be less than 25 CR. So since these 2 provisions are not in alignment with each other, these are few things which finance minister should address immediately.
And that will also depend, as Mr. Dua pointed out, on the kind of fiscal space the government has.
I think just to clarify, the limit from 25 crores to 100 crores was made by the DPIIT notification in the month of February. At that point of time, the government could not have changed the tax law because the tax law, it had to await the budget, which it will, I'm sure, that this is only an issue of timing. The DPIIT has given the intention of the government, but to put it in actual implementation, the tax law is necessary, and this is the first opportunity the new government has, and that's bound to happen.
Absolutely. So since we are talking about budget, Mr. Kailasam, what are the expectations of the startup industry from Finance Minister Mrs. Nirmala Sitharaman?
Well, from the startup industry standpoint, I think the most important thing is that it's heartening to know that the government has given serious importance to the concept of startups. And that is something which we are able to see on our day-to-day interactions with the government. We have been working for the last 6 to 7 months extensively on policy changes. India Tech as such represents founders and funds who are working in the internet-based startup space. And the interesting part is these are asset-light business models which are disrupting the market. And therefore, as regulators, as taxation folks within the government, it is important to understand these business models, and somebody has to invest time and educate the government as well in parallel to make this happen. Why this is critical for India is because if you see today, the largest chunk of the startups are emanating from US and China. The rest of the world is becoming like a consuming nation. We are uniquely positioned in India to create our own ecosystem which can make it big and go abroad. So from our standpoint, we have been representing on 3 different issues with the government. The first fundamental thing was, of course, as Mr. Ajay mentioned, we have been working with the government for the last 6 months to open up the IPO market for startups, which exists in other progressive geographies like US, China, Hong Kong and Singapore. The second part is, of course, the differential voting rights, which comes added onto it, which SEBI chairman announced the framework yesterday, which is a welcome move. And all these are positive signals in the right directions for us startups. The second part is, of course, that we are looking at a fair playing field. And here is where we have 2 kinds of issues which we have been representing to the government. One which resides on the direct tax space and the other which resides on the indirect tax space, which is largely around GST. There are a range of compliances which kick in when you are a local company versus if you are registered abroad, you tend to get exempted. That had created a bit of a fair playing field issue, which we have been representing, and DPIIT has been very forthcoming and supportive of these issues. Same is the case with Niti Aayog and PMO. In the direct tax space, of course, we have raised various issues, right from angel tax issues to ESOP taxation, which is again a critical bit because these startups emanate at an early stage. The ESOPs are given to employees. At that point of taxation, sometimes you may run into a situation where the employee has to pay a tax on that rate, which is today. He might not make that money when he actually sells it when the time comes. And he ends up paying a tax far more than what his entire year's salary could be. I mean, those are the disparities which lie, but it's a journey we are undergoing as a nation, and it's important for voices like us and the government to work closely. And the positive signal that we are seeing is that the government is encouragingly supporting this, because this is a critical layer which is not only unleashing entrepreneurship within the country, it's also creating jobs for both India and Bharat, as I call it, because you have one layer of the knowledge economy working in these startups and the other layer of the Bharat, which is also supporting as feet on the ground. This is an important layer for livelihoods, future employment, plus India's critical role in the 3 emerging blocks, which I said, which is US, China and India in the startup space. So our expectations on the budget is largely that all these teething issues which I mentioned, whether it is the GST, of course, is taken care of by the GST Council, but in terms of the direct tax, the ITCs, the ESOPs, the angel tax, and then of course the exemptions and the Sops that the government is working out are something we are looking forward very eagerly, and we believe that this is a journey. Of course, there are certain things that would get adjusted based on the budgetary limitations that the government may have, but during the course of the year we continue to engage, and this is an ongoing process. So those are our expectations from the budget.
You mentioned a very important point about GST, and I'll take that concern to Mr. Wadhwa. Mr. Wadhwa, we understand that GST is not really within the realm of the budget and is decided by the GST Council. But can the government provide GST exemption to the fund managers based in India, because such a tax does not apply to those offshore?
Government can consider, just like on the grounds on the grounds of income tax, there are few exemptions given to the startups. So on similar grounds, they can think about giving exemptions to the startups in the initial phases of their incorporation. So if they provide them exemption for 3 years, because in the initial years, whatever revenue they generate, they have to pay GST on the total revenue. But on the taxation front, it's quite different. So you pay taxes only on your income part, but in GST, you pay taxes on your revenue part. So actually, you lose minimum 18% of your total revenue towards the GST, and the compliance cost is the another thing. So if government can plan to give some exemption to the startup, that would really add some working capital to the startup, which they can use for further expansion.
Mr. Dua wanted to add.
You know, the structure of GST is slightly different from the direct taxes, and particularly now, the tax is levied at the point of consumption, not at the point of production, which used to be earlier. So it's not entirely beneficial if you say, let's remove the GST. Then you would not get any credits when you purchase things from outside. Those guys may not be startups. There is a provision in the GST that if you are liable to pay less than 1.5 crores, then instead of paying taxes at the relevant rates, you don't claim it and you just pay a lump sum 5% rate of taxation. Under that provision, yes, then you are getting exempted from this 5%. But if it is on the product which you are making, then you have the benefit of receiving credits and those get deducted. So if it is your item attracts 18%, 12% has been paid on the inputs, then you are paying only 6%. So a person, all that you can probably do is give an option that each party has to decide for itself what is beneficial for it. That's as far as GST. But I like to link the startup with what is the country's priority.
Yes.
Right now, we started in, say, as they call Modi 1.0.
Yes.
A very major mission on Make in India, and we all know that it needs to be pushed much further to be able to make effective progress. And two areas in which we need to make a lot of improvement, because the import bill is huge. One is defense, the defense equipment, and the second is electronics per se, whether it is semiconductors or electronic equipment. We continue to be these two items between themselves, Kriti, take care of more than non-oil bills. More than 50% of the non-oil bill is only on import of these two items.
You've mentioned important areas, Mr. Dua, but also tell us what are the other tax exemptions or incentives the government can provide to realize the vision of startup
exactly.
Vision 2024.
This is exactly what I was coming to. That today the startup, where the eligibility of all these taxes is, has been defined by DPIT, as well as the income tax accepts it. I am saying that could be also, in addition to all these things, that if it is gets to making any assembly, sub-assembly or components which are today being imported and are being used in the defense sector. You know, at the end of the day, we are getting exploited. We must accept the fact that when you end up paying for $10 billion for a missile system,
yes,
we don't know what it has cost to produce it. It is the technology which they are charging us for. They are charging us for all their innovations and all the. So our thrust in our startups has to be, now let's start looking at specific sectors which, if our startups make, we can be liberal with them in granting tax benefits. To start with, I'm saying all these 4 tax provisions which are eligible are there for saying, even if they do not qualify there, as long as they are producing something for making their defense equipment imported by India. Secondly, I would say the electronics. Third is, how do they help us in boosting our exports? Exports which have remained stagnant. We have barely reached this year, after a level which was attained 7 years ago in our, 2011 was the last year, our level of $311 billion export, and we just reached it now. Again, focus, you're producing items for which there is a market outside. And so that is how, on one side cutting the import bill, the other side being positively in the area of exports. These are taxation giving benefits, either in terms of exemption, is like giving a subsidy which is frowned upon by many multilateral bodies as well as our trading partners, but not these concessions would not be, because they also give them themselves.
So the focus has to be on specific sectors,
Absolutely.
particularly to propel exports.
Yeah.
But also, Mr. Kailasam, since the commencement of the Startup India initiative, the government recognized more than 18,000 startups for tax incentives. In May alone this year, the government recognized around 814 startups. That means 1 startup per hour. Do you think the government has substantially cut the red tape?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you look at the positioning that the government and the importance that it has given for the startup space, it's been phenomenal. The fact that there is a dedicated kind of a department through DPIIT now taking complete charge of this initiative, especially in the internet-based startup space and the startup ecosystem, plus the ease of doing business. In fact, the government has been more than receptive and has been hearing us out on any of the issues that we have been flagging with it. It's a journey, as I said. It's not something that can be fixed overnight, but the numbers speak for themselves that the amount of startups that have benefited in the process. It's still a long way to go, as I said, in comparative terms, but there has to be also something there where the industry has to come forth and state its concerns to the government and also offer the necessary kind of alternative narratives which are important from a solution standpoint without, of course, affecting the checks and balances which the government is very keen to maintain. We have been doing that and we have seen phenomenal results in terms of the reciprocity from the government side on each of these issues, whether it was with regard to taxation issues, whether it was with regard to ease of doing business, or for that matter, even issues with regard to GST and, of course, DVRs and the listing norms as witnessed yesterday. But yes, it's still a long way, as I said, because this is the sector which is going to produce the largest livelihood going forward. If you look at the numbers, if you take, there are already 29 odd unicorns which have already got created in the country. The amount of employment, if you start adding up, goes close to 2 million in terms of number of people. It's adding up day by day. Every startup that I meet come with a different innovative ideas which can propel, and actually our startups are going abroad as well.
Yes.
For us to have the next big names coming from this part of the world, we have been hearing those from US and China. The local ecosystem has to be supportive and conducive. We're seeing that happen, many more to go, but we are working closely on that.
Yesterday, the RBI panel on MSMEs suggested that Indian startups should not be compulsory for them. The profitability clause should not be compulsory for them.
If you look at the listing norms today, and this is something which we have been very closely working with the government on, there are three aspects to the whole process. Let's take the case of someone in India who comes with a startup idea, a great idea. My counterpart in US or Hong Kong or Singapore comes with the same idea. When we go from point A to point B in terms of funding, it's all same. When we reach a particular threshold, the promoters would have diluted their equity to reach such a stage which is sub 20%. Plus, at the same time, if you look at these businesses, they are on a constant customer acquisition mode.
Right.
And therefore, and they are also on an expansion mode. I mean, you move from city 1 to city 2 to 200 cities, 300 cities in India. You will not be showing profitability, but you are growing. And it's a fast growth. The same thing, if you see, these regulations don't exist in US, where you're allowed to list. In India, you have to have minimum of 20% promoter quota. You have to have 3 years of profitability track record, and you should have net fixed assets for a retail investment listing. If I take the QIB investment route, where 75% has to be on institutional buyers, even then, the 20% promoter quota remains. If you look at big companies like Facebook, Google's, all of them are sub 15% founder stakeholding, but they have 60% voting power, which is why they continue to drive and grow those businesses.
Right. Absolutely. So I have last 30 seconds and I'll give that to you, Mr. Dua. How do we check migration of Indian startups from India?
Make it worthwhile for them to remain here. The market is there. They have to be facilitated in being able to reach out. I would think that we've started very well, but we should keep on coming up with new ideas in the government so as to create an ecosystem, particularly at the provincial and the district level, because all the action for them is there. And yesterday's or day before's announcement by DPIIT,
yes,
Abhishek announced that, Mr. Abhishek, that we are also starting looking at ease of doing business at the district level. And to start with, we've taken up a pilot project in 6 districts. A good start, but be at it, because going forward, coming down from the 77th position to the 50th or to the 27th is going to be much tougher than coming from the 100th to 27th or earlier from 153rd to that place.
So there has to be a concerted and coordinated effort.
And action at the ground level.
Sir. Absolutely, at the ground level, very importantly. On that note, thank you so much for joining us. It's the government's massive push to exploit full potential of Indian startups. That's all we had for you in this edition. Thanks for watching and stay tuned to Rajya Sabha Television.